Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. He was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. Jacob's name was synonymous with what God was going to do in him. God changed his name to Israel. And Jacob means the heel grabber or the supplanter. And Israel means crowned prince. And from Jacob came 12 sons. And from these sons, one of them by the name of Joseph was instrumental in the salvation and the deliverance of the rest of his brothers at a particular time in Israel's history. But now Joseph is very old, and he's dying. And as he is reaching that last point of his life, leaning on his staff, he began to prophesy. And this is what he prophesied. He prophesied that God would come and visit Israel in the land of Egypt, where they were strangers, as it were, where they were fixing to become slaves for 400 years, that God would visit them and carry them up out of this foreign country of Egypt and take them to the land of Canaan that God had promised to Abraham. He reminded the children of Israel that they were waiting on a promise. Anybody in this house waiting on a promise this morning? Amen. He reminded them they were waiting on a promise. And he told them, God is going to do this. It's surely going to happen. And he said, when God does visit you and God delivers you, don't leave my old dry bones here in Egypt, but take my bones with you when you leave this place and bury them in the land of Canaan when you get to the land of promise. Now that was an exercise of faith. That was a prophetic utterance out of the mouth of a dying man who was convinced that God was going to keep his word to Abraham. That God was going to truly bring the children of Israel into the Canaan land and dispossess the people that were there and give them their territory. He was convinced of that. And so he's thinking down the road saying, hey, I don't want to be the only one that's buried back here. I want to join the future generations that will be buried in the land of promise. I want to be buried in the land of promise with everybody else that's going to be coming down the road, as it were. And so he put them under an oath to do that. Now, you do not hear about these bones until much, much later. As a matter of fact, the next time that you hear about these bones is 430 years later, and you hear about it when Moses is carrying them out along with the children of Israel. Exodus 13, 17 through 19. Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, because God had said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and go back to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. For he had placed the children of Israel under a solemn oath, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here with you. 430 430 years later, these bones are mentioned again, and they're only being mentioned in the context that God has indeed visited the children of Israel, just like Joseph had prophesied, and they are indeed coming up out of the land of Egypt and are heading into the land that will be the land of promise, and Joseph's bones are going with them, and Moses had the bones. But you see, that bothered me. And this is why that bothered me. I had to ask, why was Moses carrying the bones? Because you see, Moses was not from the tribe of Joseph, one of his descendants, but he was from the tribe of Levi, which was a brother of Joseph. The descendants of Joseph would have been Ephraim and Manasseh. And usually, instead of mentioning the tribe of Joseph throughout the rest of, throughout 1st and 2nd Chronicles, throughout 1st and 2nd Kings, usually instead of mentioning the tribe of Joseph, like the tribe of Levi or whatever, they mention Ephraim and Manasseh, who were Joseph's grandsons. So I had to ask myself, why wasn't Joseph's family in charge of those bones? Why did Moses have the bones when it would have been a descendant through an uncle and not through the direct family line? Now, I've got some speculation here because the Bible doesn't make that plain, but I've got some speculation here, but I think it's good speculation. I believe it is because these bones had become prophetic symbols. Because you see, 430 years earlier, the man who had hung on those bones prophesied that God would visit Israel, take them up out of Egypt into the promised land. So those bones had become prophetic symbols. And he had left an oath with the people that they were to take those bones too. These bones had become prophetic symbols of the faithfulness of God's promises. So Moses, who was not a man who was a brave man, Moses was indeed a timid man. There's a scripture about Moses that says that Moses was the most meek, which is another word for timid, man on the face of the earth. So Moses had tried to run from his call, but God had kept him and placed him in this position. And I believe that Moses was holding on to those bones as a reminder to him that God was going to do what God had said he was going to do. 400 years of slavery, 400 years of mistreatment, 400 years of oppression. And now Moses had been brought forth as a deliverer to deliver Israel from the hands of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. And those bones had somehow came into his possession, because the Bible clearly says in verse 19 of Exodus 13, and Moses took the bones of Joseph with him. Well, since he wasn't from the family line, the only thing that I can think of is at some point in time that those bones had been given to him as perhaps a token of the prophecy, since God had called him to deliver Israel out of Egypt. And those prophetic symbols were now very, very important to Moses. I can just see Moses when the children of Israel are in trouble and Moses is questioning God. Is Pharaoh ever going to let us go? Are we ever going to get out of this territory? Are we ever going to get and head towards promised land? And I can see him walking past those bones over there in his living room somewhere, looking over there at those bones and thinking to himself, yes, sir, Bob, there's a man who prophesied over 400 years ago that the day was coming in which we would be able to leave this oppression. He would go into Pharaoh, and Pharaoh would say, yeah, I'm going to let you go. And he would send a plague. And then the plague, the magicians would duplicate the plague. And then Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. And he would tell Moses, no, I'm not going to let y'all go. And I could see Moses going back home that evening. And he'd go over and he'd look at that old sarcophagus over there with those bones. And he might even give it a little shake and give it a little rattle. Because those bones, the man that hung on those bones had promised that one day they would indeed be delivered out of this oppression, and they would get to go to the promised land. Well, the day came and the hour came in which they crossed the Red Sea and they marched towards promised land. But I can tell you this right now, if you have read the story, you find out that the trip from Egypt to the trip to the shores of Jordan at the border of the Canaan land was not an easy trip. There was time in which the people were ready to stone Moses. There was time in which the people were complaining about not having water from a good spring source. There were times in which people were complaining about eating manna. We eat this manna every day. We're so tired of this manna. There were plagues and there were trials and tribulations, and I can just see Moses going in his tent, wondering about, the Lord got us out of Egypt. Now we're stuck out here in the wilderness. Are we ever going to get to the promised land? And he'd look over and see that sarcophagus, and he'd go over and give it a little rattle, and he'd think to himself, yes, sirree, this right here is a prophecy. This right here is a symbol. This right here is a promise. This man over 430 years ago said that one day God was going to visit us, and we were going to leave Egypt, and we were going to go to the land in which had been prophesied to us as an eternal habitation. And I remember the day when we marched out. I remember the night when the death angel visited. I remember when Miriam and her ladies grabbed their tambourines after the Red Sea collapsed back in on the armies of Pharaoh and sang the horse and the rider he has thrown into the sea. And praise God, God's got me this far. I think I can hold on a little bit longer. I think I can hold on a little bit longer because God's going to get me to the promised land. Those bones were prophetic symbols. And Moses got all the way to the promised land. He got to the border, and the Lord took him up on a mountain and said, Moses, your act of disobedience is going to keep you from going in there, but I wanted you to see it with your eyes. And then I'm fixing to take you, and I'm going to bury your body, and they're never going to find you. Moses died on that mountain. The angels of the Lord took Moses' body and buried it, but he saw the promised land. But then I had to ask myself, when they were cleaning out his tent, who got them bones? That's right. That's right. You know, if I was in Moses' tent, and there were a few things laying around, a box of old dry bones wouldn't have been the first thing I'd have picked out. I'd have picked something that was shiny and pretty, and I thought I could take it down to the pawn shop and get me some money. You know, I mean, I'd have picked out something that I could have sold on eBay or something like that. But somehow Joshua ended up with those bones. Now I'm going to prove that to you, and I want you to listen. Joshua 24. Now it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him within the border of his inheritance in Timnath-Serah, which is in the mountains of Ephraim, on the north side of Mount Gosh. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had known all the works of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Then the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel had brought up out of Egypt, they buried in Shechem in the plot of ground which Jacob had bought from one of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, which had become an inheritance of the children of Joseph. The next time the bones appeared was 7 years later, after they had crossed the Jordan River and entered into a 7-year war in which Joshua had to lead the armies of Israel to defeat the 31 kings of the land of Canaan. And verse 32 indicates that when Joshua died, then they buried the bones of Joseph. And I had to ask myself a question. Why did they record the burial of Joseph's bones immediately after Joshua's death? Why didn't they bury those bones the minute they got there? Because the first city of conquest was the city of Jericho. And Jericho was a part of the promised land. So why didn't they just go ahead and bury them that day instead of hanging around with those bones sitting around your tent for 7 years? Well, this is what I surmise. If you read Joshua chapter 1, you find out that Joshua got several things that Moses had. The first thing that Joshua got that Moses had, he got the anointing of Moses. The second thing is he got the same promises that had been made to Moses. The third thing is he got the reverential fear that the people had for Moses. And I believe that the fourth thing he got was that sarcophagus of bones. I believe it had become such a prophetic symbol that they passed it over to him. And I can just see him through 7 years of war, through 7 years of battle, through 7 years of fighting. I can just see him going over and rattling that old sarcophagus every now and then and thinking to himself, I know the battle's raging right now. We've done battled 15 major battles. We've took over 15 major territories. And we ain't even halfway through. But the man who hung on these bones prophesied the day would come in which God would visit us and take us back to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he would give us that territory as an everlasting inheritance. And we would win every battle. And it would all belong to us. And I may be weary for the last 15 battles, but I think I got a little bit of energy to go 15 more. Why? Because the prophecy that was prophesied over 437 years ago, it's come through this far, and I believe God's going to do it all the way. Amen. Now, the Bible speaks about waging war through faith in prophecy. Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy, the first chapter, verse 18, "This charge I commit to you, Timothy, according to the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by them you may wage the good warfare." Prophecies that are prophesied into our life, either directly out of the Word of God, like knock and it shall be opened, seek and ye shall find, ask and ye shall receive. See, those are prophecy or prophetic promises in which Jesus said, if you'll do these things, then I will hear your prayer and I will answer your prayer. So they're promises, but they're prophetic promises. They're something that God says is going to happen. It is conditional upon what you do, but if you're willing to do it, then I will bless you as a result of your act of faith. We as Christians have been given prophetic symbols today that the whole believing church of the living God around the world hangs on to. And those prophetic symbols are throughout the Bible, but the most important prophetic symbol throughout the Bible that you and I are holding on to is the prophecies concerning the second coming of the Lord. Now, if Moses and Joshua had that sarcophagus of bones, and that was what they rattled, and that was their reminder that what was prophesied was actually going to come to pass, then what we've got to look at concerning the second coming of the Lord is that Jesus gave certain signs and symbols that he said would happen leading up to the coming of the Lord. And as a result of that you and I could look on these things and we could see as they are being fulfilled that they are markers that God's coming is near. Isaiah, the 66th chapter, verse 8, the Bible talks about the rebirth of Israel. Who has heard such a thing? Or who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day? Or shall a nation be born all at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children. Now listen to me for just a few minutes here, just a few minutes. In Matthew the 24th chapter and Luke the 21st chapter, Jesus gives the parable of the fig tree. And the parable of the fig tree is that when you see the leaves of the fig tree blossom, then you know that summer is near. In Matthew 24 and Luke 21, he gave a variety of things that were going to happen that were prophecies. And as these events begin to happen, he tied them in to the rebirth of Israel as a nation. He said that there would be wars and rumors of war. He said there would be pestilence and famine. He said that men's hearts would be failing them because of fear. He said the waves and the seas would be raging. And he spoke about all of these signs that were signs that pointed towards the coming of the Lord. But the greatest sign of all was the rebirth of Israel, which was the blossoming of the fig tree. Now, I want you to follow this timeline. In 70 A.D., the Jews were dispersed around the world as a part of the what would eventually be the downfall of the Roman Empire. They were dispersed around the world through the persecution. 1877 years they were scattered around this globe. 1877 years Israel was not a nation. 1877 years. You could not go to a map and point to it and say this is the sovereign nation of Israel standing on the very territory that was won by Joshua, in which those 31 kings were defeated, and this is Israel's territory. You couldn't go back to that piece of land and see a cohesive, functioning nation or government. 1877 years, they were scattered all around the globe. But God had prophesied that before the second coming, that he would cause the fig tree to blossom, that he would gather them from the north, south, east, and west and bring them back to the promised land. And in 1947, about 100 Jews sailed from Cyprus back to their homeland. And within 1 year, May the 14th of 1948, David Ben-Gurion unfurled the Israeli national flag, and Israel became a nation once more. 12 minutes after they declared themselves a sovereign nation, just 1 year after having come back to this territory, our president, Harry Truman, called the Prime Minister of Israel and says the United States of America recognizes Israel as a sovereign nation. That's what Isaiah said. Can a nation be born at once? Well, it happened just like that. Nation building takes years. Sometimes it's taken centuries. But in this case, in the space of a year, they went from not being a nation to being a sovereign nation, recognized by the greatest power in the world, the United States of America. And this prophecy was fulfilled, and that was in 1947. What we see hanging in front of us over there in Israel right now, with the world having done everything they could since 1947 to stop them, but they are more powerful today than they have ever been before. What they are to us is our prophetic symbols that says is God can take a nation that was dispersed for 1,877 years and in the space of 12 months make them a sovereign nation again. If God can do that for them, God can do His promises for us. Stick with me here. I'm fixing to close. Prophetic symbols. I charge this charge I commit to you, son Timothy, according to the prophecies previously made concerning you, that by those prophecies, you may wage the good warfare. You see, you sit in the house of God and your life's in trouble. But you think about a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago in which God made a promise concerning you. God said, I'm going to do this and this in your life. But you're just like Moses was. You're going in and out of the court of Pharaoh, and he's turning you down time and time again. You're like Joshua was. You're going from one battle to the next battle, to the next battle, to the next battle. And you wonder within yourself, is it ever going to happen? Are the promises ever going to happen? It is. We are told that Timothy pastored the largest church in Ephesus. Some have said that the reach of his church was up to 200,000 people. Now that's conjecture on some people's parts, but it seems to historically be verifiable based on the fact that you have several commentaries pointing that way. So if this were indeed the case, and he was the pastor of a mega church, then I can promise you he had trials and tribulations galore. But Paul is encouraging him here, saying, I know you're down and out right now. I've told you to take a little wine for your stomach's sake and your often infirmities. I know you're going through trouble right now, but I want you to remember those prophecies that God prophesied over you of what He was going to do in your life, and you fight the good fight of faith in the middle of this current trial, believing that God is going to keep His word to you. Can I tell you this morning, if God has ever made a promise to you, God has not forgotten it. God has not laid it aside. God has not changed His mind. What you and I are going to have to do is what Joshua did and what Moses did and what Timothy did. We're going to have to hang on and rattle our prophetic bones and believe God that a miracle is coming our way into our lives. Somebody ought to say amen. Would you please stand, praise team, if you'll come this way.